Tara, and this is my favourite book from when I was a kid. It's Roald Dahl, The Twits, which is about Mr. and Mrs. Twit, who are absolutely horrid to each other. So I'm just going to read you a part from the book that I love the most. It's called The Wormy Spaghetti. Next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no spaghetti. No worms. "It's called Squiggly Spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "Do you want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why had it a bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stomping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. That's Mr. and Mrs. Twit and the story of the Wormy Spaghetti.